The richest man in the Western Territories stood alone in his mansion, surrounded by gold he couldn't spend and land that stretched beyond sight. Yet he had never felt more invisible. Victor Hale owned everything except the one thing that mattered, someone who saw him as more than his fortune. Tonight, he would make a decision that would either destroy him or save him. He would abandon his empire, erase his identity, and walk into a frontier town as a nameless beggar. If love existed, he would find it in the dust and poverty of a place called Ash Hollow. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you enjoy it, hit that like button and stick around until the end. The evening sun bled across the Montana horizon like a wound that wouldn't close, painting Victor Hale's empire in shades of copper and shadow. He stood on the wraparound porch of his mansion, a structure so grand it had taken 2 years and 40 men to build, and felt absolutely nothing. Below him, the valley sprawled in every direction. Cattle grazed on grass his money had irrigated. Fences marked boundaries his lawyers had fought for. Barns held grain his contracts had secured. It was an empire built on shrewd decisions, ruthless negotiations, and the kind of calculated ambition that turned dirt into gold. And Victor Hale hated every inch of it. Not the wealth itself. That would be a lie. He appreciated fine whiskey, imported cigars, and the security that came from never worrying about tomorrow. What he hated was simpler and more devastating. No one had looked at him, truly looked at him, in over a decade. "Mr. Hale, sir?" Victor didn't turn. His butler Martin stood in the doorway with the kind of practiced deference that came from years of employment. Respectful, professional, utterly hollow. "The mayor is here, sir. He says it's urgent." "It's always urgent with Mayor Whitmore," Victor said quietly. "Tell him I'll be down shortly." "Of course, sir." Martin disappeared without another word, his footsteps fading into the cavernous silence of the house. Victor exhaled slowly, watching the last of the sun slip behind the mountains. The mayor wanted something. They always did. A donation for the church, an investment in the railroad expansion, a favor that only the richest man in 3 territories could provide. They would smile, laugh at his jokes, compliment his taste, and the moment they got what they needed, they would leave. Because they didn't see Victor Hale. They saw opportunity. 20 minutes later, Victor sat across from Mayor Whitmore in the study, nursing a glass of bourbon he didn't want while the mayor droned on about property taxes and infrastructure development. "You understand, Victor, this benefits everyone," Whitmore said, leaning forward with the kind of enthusiasm that always preceded a request for money. "The railroad extension through the valley would triple commerce. Your cattle operation alone would see—" "How much do you need?" Victor interrupted. Whitmore blinked. "I'm sorry?" "How much money do you need from me to make this happen?" The mayor's expression flickered. Surprise, calculation, greed, before settling back into rehearsed sincerity. "Well, I hadn't intended to—" "15,000, Victor said flatly. "I'll wire it tomorrow." "Anything else?" Whitmore stammered through gratitude that sounded like a speech he'd practiced in the mirror. Victor barely heard it. He was watching the mayor's eyes, searching for something real beneath the performance. There was nothing. 10 minutes later, Whitmore was gone, leaving Victor alone in a study filled with expensive furniture and suffocating silence. He poured another bourbon. Then he made a decision that would change everything. Victor Hale disappeared on a Tuesday morning in late August. No announcement, no letters, no explanation to the staff who arrived to find the mansion empty and the master bedroom untouched. Martin found a sealed envelope on the desk with instructions written in Victor's precise handwriting. "Manage the estate as usual. I will return when I'm ready. Do not look for me." Inside the envelope was a bank draft for 6 months' operating expenses and a bonus that would keep the entire staff comfortable through winter. But Victor himself was gone. He had left before dawn, riding east on a horse he'd saddled himself, wearing clothes he'd borrowed from the bunkhouse, torn trousers, a faded work shirt, scuffed boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard labor. In his saddlebag, $50, a canteen, and nothing else. No identification, no letters of credit, no proof of who he was or what he owned. For the first time in 20 years, Victor Hale was nobody, and terrifyingly, it felt like freedom. Ash Hollow wasn't much of a town. A single dirt road ran down the center, flanked by weathered buildings that looked like they'd been hammered together during a windstorm and had barely survived. The general store, the blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as the town hall, a boarding house with a crooked sign that promised clean beds in letters that hadn't been repainted since statehood. Victor, now calling himself Elias Grant, a name he'd borrowed from a gravestone 2 towns back, rode in just after noon on a Thursday, his face sunburned and his body aching from 3 days of hard riding. The town square was nearly empty. A few men sat outside the saloon, smoking and playing cards with the kind of lazy intensity that came from having nowhere else to be. A woman swept the boardwalk in front of the general store, eyeing Victor with the practiced suspicion small towns reserved for strangers. A dog slept in the shade, too hot to bother barking. Victor dismounted near a stone well in the center of the square, his legs stiff and his throat dry. He dropped the bucket, heard the distant splash, and hauled it back up with hands that already ached from the unfamiliar work. The water was cool and clean. He drank straight from the bucket, not caring about manners or appearances. When he finally came up for air, he realized someone was watching him. A young woman stood near the corner of a small building, barely more than a shack, with a wooden sign that read, "Lynn's Laundry" in simple painted letters. She was Chinese, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a plain cotton dress faded from too many washings. Her hands were red and raw, the kind of damage that came from years of lye soap and scalding water. But it was her eyes that stopped Victor cold. They weren't suspicious, weren't calculating. They were simply kind. She walked toward him slowly, carrying a dented tin cup in one hand. Victor watched her approach, unsure what to expect. She stopped a few feet away, dipped the cup into the bucket, and held it out to him. "You look thirsty," she said quietly. Her English was clear but careful, each word chosen with precision. Victor stared at the cup for a long moment. When was the last time someone had done something for him without wanting anything in return? He couldn't remember. "Thank you," he said, taking the cup carefully. Their fingers didn't touch, but he felt the gesture more deeply than any handshake he'd ever received. The water tasted like the cleanest thing he'd ever drunk. She gave a small nod, took the cup back when he finished, and walked away without another word. Victor stood there long after she disappeared into the laundry, feeling something strange and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Recognition, not of who he was, but of who he wanted to be. Victor, Elias, found work before sunset. The boarding house manager, a thick-shouldered woman named Mrs. Calloway, eyed him with the kind of skepticism that came from years of dealing with drifters who promised work and delivered excuses. "You done ranch work before?" she asked, arms crossed. "Some," Victor lied. "Hauling grain, fixing fence, mucking stables." "All of it," Mrs. Calloway snorted. "Your hands say different, but Tom Brewster needs help at the freight yard. He'll pay $1 a day if you can keep up. You break down, you're out. Understood?" "Understood." She jabbed a thumb toward the back of the boarding house. "Bed's $2 a week, meals included. You want it?" Victor handed over $4, 2 weeks in advance. Mrs. Calloway pocketed the money and gave him a long, measuring look. "You running from something, Elias Grant?" "No, ma'am." "Running toward something, then?" Victor hesitated. "Maybe." She grunted, unimpressed but satisfied. "Freight yard opens at dawn. Don't be late." The work nearly killed him. Victor had never done manual labor in his life. His fortune had been built on contracts, negotiations, and careful investments, work done with pens and ledgers, not hammers and sweat. The freight yard was different. Tom Brewster, a grizzled man with a beard like steel wool and a voice that could crack stone, handed Victor a shovel and pointed at a wagon piled high with grain sacks. "Unload that by noon. Stack 'em in the barn. Don't tear the sacks." Victor looked at the wagon. There had to be 200 sacks. Brewster grinned. "Problem?" "No, sir." "Good. Get moving." By the time the sun hit its peak, Victor's hands were bleeding. His shoulders screamed. His back felt like someone had driven nails into his spine. He unloaded 170 sacks. Brewster walked over, looked at the remaining pile, and shook his head. "Not fast enough. Try again tomorrow." Victor collapsed onto a crate, gasping, too exhausted to argue. Brewster tossed him a canteen. "You're tougher than you look. Most city boys quit after the first hour. Victor drank, the water cutting through the dust in his throat. I'm not a city boy. Sure you're not. Brewster walked away, chuckling. That night, Victor lay in his narrow boarding house bed, every muscle in his body screaming. His hands were wrapped in torn cloth. His shoulders throbbed, and for the first time in years, he slept deeply. Days became weeks. Victor learned the rhythm of hard labor. The ache in his muscles became familiar, almost comforting. His hands grew calloused, his back grew stronger. He unloaded wagons, fixed fences, hauled stone for the new church foundation. The work was brutal, but it was real. And every evening, when the sun began its slow descent, Victor walked past the small laundry on the corner of the square. Sometimes the young woman, Lynn, he'd learned her name from Mrs. Calloway, was hanging wet clothes on the line, her movements efficient and practiced. Sometimes she was inside, visible through the open door, scrubbing fabric in a steaming tub. They rarely spoke. But sometimes she would glance up, see him walking past, and nod. And sometimes she would leave a tin cup of water on the railing outside her door. Victor never asked if it was for him. He always drank it. The first real conversation happened on a Saturday evening in late September. Victor was walking past the laundry when he saw Lynn struggling with a heavy basket of wet clothes, trying to lift it onto the porch. He stopped without thinking. Need help? She looked up, surprised. For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then she stepped back. Please. Victor lifted the basket easily. Months of freight work had given him strength he'd never had before, and set it on the porch. Thank you, she said quietly. No trouble. He turned to leave. Wait. Victor stopped. Lynn disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a small cloth bundle. She held it out. You're always walking past when I'm closing up, she said. You must get hungry. Victor took the bundle carefully. Inside was a piece of bread and a small portion of dried meat. It was the kind of meal someone shared when they didn't have much to spare. I can't, he started. You work hard, she said simply. Harder than most men I've seen. Victor looked at her, really looked at her. Her hands were cracked from lie. Her dress was mended in 3 places. The laundry behind her was small and worn, the kind of business that survived on pennies and pride. She had almost nothing, and she was sharing it with a stranger. Thank you, Victor said, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded and went back inside. Victor stood on the porch for a long moment, holding the bundle like it was something precious. Because it was. The next week, Victor began finding small ways to help. He never asked, never made a show of it. He just did things. When he saw the laundry's rain barrel was cracked, he fixed it after dark with borrowed tools and tar. When Lynn's father, a frail man in his 60s who rarely left the back room, needed firewood, Victor left a stack by the door before dawn. When the laundry's roof began leaking during a storm, Victor climbed up and patched it while Lynn was at the general store. She never said anything. But the next time he walked past, there was a full meal waiting on the porch railing, still warm. They were building something fragile and unspoken, a language without words, trust without transactions. Victor had never felt anything like it. October brought the first signs of trouble. The creek that fed Ash Hollow's wells began to slow. The rains that usually soaked the valley in autumn never came. The air grew dry and brittle, carrying dust that coated everything. Farmers started to worry. Then the well in the town square began to fail. The bucket came up with less water each day. What had once been cool and clean now tasted of mud and minerals. The laundry suffered first. Lynn needed water, gallons of it, to wash clothes. Without the well, she had to haul it from the creek, a 2-mile walk each way. Victor watched her make the journey 3 times in one day, carrying heavy buckets that left her hands shaking. That night, he made the walk himself, filling every container he could carry and leaving them outside her door. When she found them in the morning, she stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the water like it was a mystery she couldn't solve. Victor watched from across the square, hidden in the early morning shadows. He had money. He had power. He could fix this with a single telegram to his lawyers. But the moment he revealed who he was, everything would change. She would see him differently. And Victor realized, with a clarity that felt like fear, that he couldn't bear that. November brought the landlord. His name was Clayton Marsh, a thin man with sharp features and a smile that never reached his eyes. He owned half the buildings in Ash Hollow, including the small laundry. Victor was hauling stone when he saw Marsh knock on Lynn's door. The conversation was brief. Marsh spoke. Lynn listened, her face growing pale. When Marsh left, he was smiling. Lynn stood in the doorway, gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Victor dropped the stone and crossed the square without thinking. What did he want? Lynn looked at him, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes. More rent, she said quietly. Double. Starting next month. Can you pay it? She shook her head. We barely make enough now. Without the well, people aren't bringing as much laundry. The drought... She stopped, pressing her lips together. Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. He could fix this. One letter. One bank transfer. But it would be a lie. I'll figure something out, Lynn said, straightening her shoulders. We always do. She went back inside, closing the door gently. Victor stood in the square, fists clenched, staring at the building that housed the only real thing in his life. And he made a decision. A terrible, necessary decision. 2 days later, a lawyer from 3 towns over visited Clayton Marsh with an offer. An anonymous buyer wanted to purchase the laundry building outright. Cash payment. No questions. The price was triple what the property was worth. Marsh took the deal before the ink was dry. The next morning, Lynn found a letter slipped under her door. The building had been purchased by a distant benefactor, someone who admired her work and wanted to help. The rent was forgiven. The building was hers, free and clear. Lynn read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. Then she walked to the boarding house and found Victor, Elias, eating breakfast in the dining hall. Did you do this? She asked quietly. Victor looked up, his heart hammering. Do what? Someone bought the laundry, gave it to us. He met her eyes, forcing himself to stay calm. That's wonderful. Was it you? How could it be me? Victor said carefully. I barely make enough to pay for this room. Lynn studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. She turned to leave, then paused. Whoever it was, I wish I could thank them. I'm sure they know, Victor said quietly. She left. Victor sat alone in the dining hall, staring at his half-eaten breakfast. He had saved her. And it felt like the worst thing he'd ever done, because it was built on a lie. And lies, Victor was learning, had a way of growing until they swallowed everything real. December arrived with the kind of cold that turned breath into clouds and froze the mud solid. The drought hadn't broken. The creek was barely a trickle. The town well was nearly dry. But Lynn's laundry survived. And slowly, carefully, something grew between her and the man she knew as Elias Grant. They talked more now. Short conversations at first, the weather, the work. Small observations about life in Ash Hollow, then deeper things. One evening, Lynn told him about her father, how they had come to America 15 years ago searching for safety and opportunity, how her mother had died on the journey, how they had built the laundry from nothing, washing clothes for miners and ranchers who sometimes paid and sometimes didn't. We survived, she said simply. That's what matters. Victor listened, feeling the weight of his deception grow heavier with every word. What about you? Lynn asked. Where are you from? Victor hesitated. He had prepared answers for this. Simple lies. But looking at her, at the honesty in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to say them. I'm from a place where people only saw what I could give them, he said quietly. Not who I was. Lynn was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. I understand that. And Victor believed she did. On Christmas Eve, the town held a small gathering in the saloon. It wasn't much. Some donated food, a fiddle player, a few decorations made from pine branches and ribbon. But it was warm and real. Victor stood near the back, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the townspeople laugh and dance. Lynn appeared beside him, wearing a dress he'd never seen before, dark blue, simple, but clean and carefully mended. You're not dancing? She asked. I don't know how. She smiled, a real smile, soft and genuine. Neither do I. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration. Then Lynn said quietly, "Thank you." Victor looked at her. "For what?" "For being here. For being real." Victor's throat tightened. If only she knew. "You're welcome," he managed. Lynn reached out and gently touched his hand, just for a moment. Then she walked away, leaving Victor standing alone with the warmth of that touch burning through him like a brand. He had never felt more seen, and he had never felt like more of a fraud. January brought the unraveling. It started with a stranger. A tall man in an expensive coat rode into Ash Hollow on a cold Tuesday afternoon, his horse sleek and well-fed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Victor was hauling grain when he heard the voice. "Well, I'll be damned." He froze. The stranger was staring at him, grinning wide. It was Richard Langford, a cattle rancher from 2 territories over, a business associate, a man who had been to Victor's mansion a dozen times. Victor's blood turned to ice. "Victor Hale!" Langford shouted, loud enough for half the square to hear. "What in hell are you doing in a place like this?" Every head turned. Victor stood paralyzed, the grain sack slipping from his hands. Langford rode closer, laughing like this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "The richest man in Montana, hauling grain like a stable boy. Wait till I tell the others. They'll never believe it." The square had gone silent. Victor could feel eyes on him, curious, confused, suspicious. And then he saw Lynn. She was standing in the doorway of the laundry, staring at him. Her face was unreadable. "Victor Hale," she said quietly. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Langford kept talking, oblivious. "What's this about, Victor? Some kind of social experiment? Studying the common folk?" Victor finally found his voice. "Langford, leave." "Leave? But I just got here. Come on, let me buy you a drink. We can leave now." Something in Victor's tone cut through Langford's amusement. The rancher's smile faded. He looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, suddenly aware that he'd stepped into something he didn't understand. "Fine," Langford muttered. "Suit yourself." He rode off, shaking his head. The square remained silent. Victor turned slowly toward the laundry. Lynn was still standing in the doorway. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Victor saw everything change. The warmth, the trust, the fragile, beautiful thing they had built together. Gone. "Were you ever real?" she asked, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. Victor took a step forward. "Lynn, please." She stepped back, shaking her head. "Don't." The door closed, and Victor stood alone in the square, surrounded by people who finally knew his name, but no longer knew him at all. The silence in Ash Hollow Square lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then the whispers started. Victor heard them ripple outward like stones dropped in still water, fragments of his name mixing with disbelief and anger. "Victor Hale? The cattle baron? Been lying to us this whole time?" Mrs. Calloway appeared on the boarding house steps, her face harder than granite. "You've got 10 minutes to clear out your room, Mr. Hale. I don't rent to liars." Tom Brewster spat into the dust. "And I don't employ them. Consider yourself fired." Victor didn't respond. He couldn't take his eyes off the closed laundry door. Through the window, he could see movement, Lynn's silhouette pacing back and forth in the small room. Her father's voice, low and concerned. Lynn's sharp response, too quiet to hear but unmistakable in its pain. Victor took a step toward the building. "I wouldn't." Brewster moved to block his path. "You've done enough damage. I need to explain." "Explain what?" The freight master's voice was cold. "That you turned this town into your personal theater? That you made fools of all of us?" "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Mrs. Calloway demanded. "A rich man playing poor, testing us like we're animals in a cage?" The crowd was growing now. More faces appeared. The blacksmith, the general store owner, farmhands Victor had worked alongside for months. People he'd shared meals with, laughed with, bled with. And now they looked at him like a stranger. Worse than a stranger, a liar. "I didn't come here to mock anyone Victor said, his voice rough. "I came here to find something real." "Real?" Brewster's laugh was bitter. "There's nothing real about a man who lies about his own name." Victor had no answer for that. Because Brewster was right. He gathered his few belongings from the boarding house in silence: a spare shirt, the torn work clothes, $50 that felt like a fortune and a joke all at once. 50 scene. As he walked to the livery to retrieve his horse, he passed the laundry one more time. The door remained closed. Lynn didn't come out. Victor mounted his horse and rode west without looking back, even though every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to knock on that door, to make her understand. But what could he say that wouldn't sound like another lie? The truth was simple and devastating. He had become exactly what he'd feared, a man who used people for his own purposes, no matter how noble he believed those purposes to be. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above him, vast and indifferent. Victor rode until dark, then made camp in a hollow between two hills where no one could see the richest man in the territory sitting alone by a dying fire, staring at his calloused hands and wondering what they'd been working toward all along. Victor returned to his mansion 3 days later. Martin opened the door with the same professional deference he'd always shown, as if Victor had simply been on a short business trip rather than disappearing for 4 months. "Welcome home, sir. Shall I prepare your usual rooms?" Victor walked past him without answering, his boots tracking mud across the polished marble floor. The mansion felt like a mausoleum. Every expensive fixture, every imported painting, every piece of furniture carefully selected to demonstrate wealth and taste. It all felt hollow. Victor climbed the stairs to his study and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. The estate reports were stacked neatly, waiting for his review. Martin had managed everything perfectly, as always. The ranch was thriving, profits were up. Several new contracts had been negotiated in his absence. His empire had barely noticed he was gone. Victor pushed the papers aside and stared out the window at the valley below. From here, he could see everything he owned, and none of it mattered. Because somewhere in a struggling frontier town, a woman with kind eyes and worn hands thought he'd used her as an experiment, and he had no way to prove otherwise. The weeks that followed were worse than Victor could have imagined. He tried to work, tried to focus on contracts and negotiations and the 1,000 details that came with managing an empire, but every meeting felt like play acting, every smile felt manufactured, every handshake felt like a transaction. Mayor Whitmore visited again, full of compliments and requests. Victor signed the checks without listening. Business associates came to discuss expansion opportunities. Victor nodded at the right moments and forgot everything they said the moment they left. At night, he stood on the mansion's porch and stared east toward Ash Hollow, toward the only place he'd ever felt seen. Martin found him there one evening in late January, wrapped in an expensive coat that did nothing to cut the cold. "Sir, you should come inside. It's below freezing." "I'm fine, Martin." "Respectfully, sir, you haven't been fine since you returned." Victor glanced at the butler. In all the years Martin had worked for him, the man had never offered an unsolicited opinion. "What makes you say that?" Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "You've been home for 3 weeks, sir. You haven't touched your cigars. You haven't read a single book. You sit in your study for hours and accomplish nothing." He paused. "If I may be so bold, you seem like a man who left something important behind." Victor's jaw tightened. "I hurt someone," he said quietly. "Someone who didn't deserve it." "Then perhaps you should make it right." "I don't know how." Martin nodded slowly. "Then perhaps, sir, you should start by figuring that out." The butler withdrew, leaving Victor alone with the Montana wind and a question he couldn't answer. How do you make right a lie built on good intentions? The answer came from an unexpected source. In early February, a drought report crossed Victor's desk, a technical document from the Territorial Surveyor's Office detailing water table levels across the region. Victor had seen dozens of these reports over the years. Usually he skimmed them for information relevant to his grazing lands and filed them away. This time, he read every word. The report confirmed what he'd seen in Ash Hollow. The water table was dropping across the eastern territories. Wells that had run strong for decades were failing. Creeks were drying up. Towns were struggling. But buried in the technical language was something else. A reference to historical surveys from the 1840s that mentioned an underground spring system west of Ash Hollow. The springs had never been developed. The terrain was too rough, the rock too hard, but the early surveyors had noted significant water flow. Victor read the passage 3 times. Then he pulled out his collection of old territorial maps and spread them across his desk. Most of the maps were crude, drawn by expedition teams decades before proper surveying equipment existed. But they all showed the same thing: a network of underground waterways west of Ash Hollow, flowing beneath hills of solid granite. The springs were there, untapped, forgotten, but real. Victor sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Words wouldn't earn back Lynn's trust. Apologies wouldn't undo the deception. But water. Water could save Ash Hollow, and maybe, just maybe, prove that Elias Grant had been more real than Victor Hale ever was. Victor left the mansion before dawn the next morning. He didn't tell Martin where he was going. He took his horse, a bedroll, 2 canteens, and the surveyor's map, and a pickaxe. The ride to Ash Hollow took 2 days. Victor made camp in the hills west of town, far enough away that no one would see him. He studied the old maps by firelight, comparing terrain features to the surveyor's notes. The springs should be here, beneath a rocky hillside about 3 miles from town. Should be, but should be and are were separated by layers of granite and hope. The next morning, Victor began to dig. The ground was frozen solid. The pickaxe rang against stone with each strike, the impact rattling through Victor's shoulders and spine. He worked until his hands bled through the calluses he'd built loading freight. Then he wrapped them in torn cloth and kept working. By sunset, he'd managed to clear maybe 3 feet of earth. 3 feet, to reach an underground spring that might not even exist. Victor sat on a boulder, staring at the pathetic hole he'd made, and laughed. It was insane. Impossible. He should hire a crew, buy drilling equipment, do this the smart way, the way a man with his resources would do it. But that was Victor Hale's way. And Victor Hale had failed. Elias Grant, the man who had earned Lynn's respect through honest work, would do it differently. He would dig with his own hands, or die trying. The first week nearly broke him. Victor worked from dawn until dark, swinging the pickaxe until his arms felt like lead and his vision blurred. The granite fought him for every inch. Some days he made good progress, clearing 2 or 3 feet of earth and loose rock. Other days he spent hours chipping away at solid stone that refused to yield, making progress measured in inches. His hands became raw wounds wrapped in increasingly dirty bandages. His shoulders screamed with every swing. His back felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through his spine. At night, he collapsed in his bedroll, too exhausted to eat, waking before dawn to do it all again. No one from Ash Hollow came to investigate. Victor had chosen his spot carefully, hidden behind a rise, far enough from the main trails that casual travelers wouldn't notice. He was completely alone. And strangely, the solitude felt like clarity. There were no expectations out here, no performances, no one to impress or disappoint. Just a man, a pickaxe, and the honest work of trying to make something right. On the 8th day, someone found him. Victor was deep in the excavation, nearly 6 feet down now, when he heard footsteps on the rocks above. He looked up, squinting against the morning sun. Tom Brewster stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Brewster said, "What in hell are you doing?" Victor wiped sweat from his face, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheek. "Digging." "I can see that. Why?" "There's a spring down here, underground. If I can reach it, it could supply water to Ash Hollow." Brewster looked at the pit, then at Victor's bandaged hands, then back at the pit. "You're digging for a maybe?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." "With a pickaxe?" "I don't need anything else." Brewster was quiet for a moment, then he shook his head. "You're either the most stubborn man I've ever met or the biggest fool." "Probably both." Something flickered in Brewster's expression. Not quite forgiveness, but not quite hostility either. "How deep do you need to go?" Victor checked his surveyor's map, now crumpled and stained with sweat. "The old report suggests 20 feet, maybe more." Brewster snorted. "You'll be dead before you hit 15. Then I'll die trying." The freight-master studied him for a long moment. Then, to Victor's shock, Brewster climbed down into the pit and picked up a second tool, a heavy iron bar Victor had been using to pry loose rocks. "What are you doing?" Victor asked. "What's it look like?" "I'm helping." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Brewster positioned the bar against a stubborn boulder. But I spent 30 years in these territories, and I've seen a lot of liars. Men who talk big and deliver nothing. He heaved, muscles straining. You lied about your name, but you never lied about the work. He got the boulder loose. It tumbled to the bottom of the pit with a heavy thud. Brewster looked at Victor. Maybe that counts for something? Victor felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you, he said quietly. Brewster grunted. Don't thank me yet. We've got 14 feet to go. Word spread slowly. By the second week, others started appearing. First the blacksmith, who brought proper drilling equipment and showed Victor how to set charges in the rock without killing them both. Then a few of the farmhands who'd worked alongside Victor in the freight yard. Then Mrs. Calloway, who arrived with a wagon full of food and bandages and a look that dared anyone to comment on her presence. They didn't work every day. Most had jobs and families to tend. But they came when they could, and slowly, impossibly, the pit grew deeper. 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet. The work was brutal, dangerous. Every day brought new challenges, collapses, injuries, equipment failures. But they kept digging, and Victor worked harder than anyone. He was always first to arrive and last to leave. His hands were permanent wounds now, wrapped in so many layers of bandages he could barely grip the pickaxe. His body was a map of bruises and cuts. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because somewhere in Ash Hollow, Lynn was still struggling to keep her laundry running with a failing well, and every swing of the pickaxe was a word in the only apology that mattered. Lynn heard about the digging on a cold morning in late February. She was hauling water from the creek, her third trip of the day, when she encountered Mrs. Calloway on the road. The boarding house owner was driving a wagon loaded with supplies, heading west. "Morning, Lynn." Lynn nodded, too tired to speak. Mrs. Calloway studied her for a moment. "You should come see what's happening out past Miller's Ridge. I have work to do. This is more important than work." Lynn set down her buckets, arms trembling. "What's out there?" Mrs. Calloway's expression was complicated, part frustration, part respect, part something Lynn couldn't identify. "Victor Hale is digging for water, has been for 2 weeks. By hand mostly, though some of us have been helping." She paused. "He's trying to reach an underground spring. Says if he can tap it, Ash Hollow will have water again." Lynn felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Why would he do that?" "You'd have to ask him yourself." Mrs. Calloway clicked her tongue at the horses. "But if I had to guess, I'd say he's trying to prove something." The wagon rolled away, leaving Lynn standing alone on the road. She should ignore it, should focus on her work, her father, her survival. Victor Hale, Elias Grant, whoever he was, had lied to her, had made her believe in something that wasn't real. Why should she care what he was doing now? But that night, lying in her narrow bed, Lynn couldn't stop thinking about it. About a man digging through solid rock with his bare hands. About the tin cup of water she'd given a stranger. About the kindness in his eyes when he'd helped her carry laundry, fixed her roof, left firewood by her door. Had that been a lie? Or had something real existed beneath the deception? Lynn didn't have an answer. But 3 days later, she made the walk to Miller's Ridge. She found them just after noon. A group of men clustered around a deep excavation, hauling rocks and dirt in buckets attached to a makeshift pulley system. Lynn stood at a distance, watching. She recognized Tom Brewster, the blacksmith, several farmhands, and at the bottom of the pit, barely visible, a figure covered in dust and sweat, swinging a pickaxe with methodical determination. Victor. Lynn watched him work for a long time. His movements were practiced now, efficient. Strike, shift, strike again. Clear the rubble. Repeat. There was no performance in it, no showmanship, just brutal, honest labor. Mrs. Calloway appeared beside her, wiping sweat from her face. "Been here long?" "A few minutes." "He's been at it for 3 weeks now. We're at 18 feet. The surveyors think the spring should be around 22. Lynn was quiet. Mrs. Calloway continued. "I was angry at him too, you know. Felt like a fool for not seeing through the disguise." She paused. "But I've been watching him work. And I'll tell you what I see. A man who's trying to earn back something he lost. He lied about who he was." "He did." Mrs. Calloway's voice was firm. "But he never lied about the work, never took shortcuts, never asked for special treatment." She looked at Lynn. The question is, does the truth of what he did matter more than the lies he told? Lynn didn't answer. She turned and walked back toward town, her mind churning. The breakthrough came on a gray morning in early March. Victor was 20 feet down, working alone. The others hadn't arrived yet. When the pickaxe struck something different. Not granite, not packed earth, something that felt almost soft. He struck again, harder. The pickaxe sank deep. Water seeped around the blade. Victor's heart hammered. He dropped to his knees, digging with his hands now, tearing at the damp soil. The seepage increased, a trickle, then a steady flow. Then, water burst from the earth like a living thing. It fountained up, cold and clear, soaking Victor in seconds. He fell backward, gasping as the spring erupted around him. 21 days of digging, 21 days of doubt and pain and impossible hope. And it was real. The spring was real. Victor started laughing, exhausted, delirious laughter that echoed off the pit walls. "Brewster," he shouted. "Brewster, get down here!" Within minutes, the pit was crowded with people. Someone rigged the pulley to start pumping water to the surface. Someone else ran to town to spread the news. The spring flowed steadily, more water than Ash Hollow could use in a year. Mrs. Calloway appeared at the edge of the pit, staring down at the flowing water with something like wonder. "You actually did it," she said. Victor looked up at her, soaking wet and covered in mud, and felt something close to redemption. "We did it," he corrected. The celebration in Ash Hollow that night was bigger than Christmas. People poured into the square as word spread. The spring was real. The water was flowing. The town was saved. Tom Brewster organized crews to run pipes from the spring to the town well. The blacksmith promised new fixtures and channels. Farmers talked about irrigation and crops. For the first time in months, Ash Hollow felt like it had a future. Victor stood at the edge of the celebration, watching from a distance. He'd cleaned up as best he could, borrowed clean clothes, washed the worst of the dirt from his face and hands, but he stayed in the shadows. This wasn't his victory to claim. He'd done the work for one person, and she was nowhere to be seen. "Looking for someone?" Victor turned. Lynn stood a few feet away, holding something in her hands. A dented tin cup, the same cup she'd given him that first day in Ash Hollow. Victor's throat tightened. Lynn walked closer, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Calloway told me what you did," she said quietly. "How long you worked, how deep you had to dig." Victor didn't respond. Couldn't. "She said you nearly killed yourself out there, that your hands are so damaged the doctor doesn't know if they'll ever fully heal." "They'll heal," Victor said roughly. Lynn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Why? Why what? Why dig for water? Why risk everything? You're rich. You could have hired a crew, bought equipment, done it the easy way." Victor met her eyes. "Because the easy way would have been another lie," he said, "and I'm done lying to you." Lynn's expression flickered, something between pain and understanding. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really?" Victor took a breath. "My name is Victor Hale. I own the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. I have more money than I'll ever spend in land that stretches beyond sight." He paused. "And none of it ever made me feel as real as carrying laundry for you." Lynn was quiet. "I came to Ash Hollow to find something I'd lost," Victor continued. "I wanted to know if anyone could see me, really see me, without the money and the power. And you did. You saw Elias Grant, a nobody with nothing, and you treated him with more kindness than anyone ever showed Victor Hale." "So it was a test," Lynn said softly. "No." Victor's voice was firm. "It was a hope, and then it became the most real thing in my life. Every moment with you, every conversation, every shared meal, that was real. The only thing that wasn't real was my name." Lynn looked down at the cup in her hands. "You should have told me." "I know. I trusted you." "I know. And you broke that trust." Victor nodded slowly. "I did. And I can't undo that. But I can show you, not with words, but with work, that the man who helped you, who fixed your roof and left firewood and dug through 20 feet of granite, that man was real." Lynn was silent for a long time. The celebration continued around them, but Victor barely heard it. All his attention was focused on the woman standing before him, holding a tin cup like it was the most important thing in the world. Finally, Lynn looked up. "The spring you found," she said. "It will save this town." "It will. People are calling it a miracle. It's just water." "No." Lynn's voice was quiet but certain. "It's proof that you meant what you said, that Elias Grant wasn't just a disguise." She held out the cup. Victor stared at it, not understanding. Then Lynn walked to the newly flowing town well, already running with spring water, and filled the cup. She walked back and held it out to him. "You look thirsty," she said. The same words from that first day. But everything had changed. Victor took the cup with shaking hands and drank. The water was cold and clean and tasted like forgiveness. When he lowered the cup, Lynn was still there, still watching him with those kind, steady eyes. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely," she said quietly. "Not yet. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day. I understand. But I believe you're trying to earn it back. And that," she paused, "that matters." Victor nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Lynn took the cup back. "We'll see what happens." She turned to leave. Then she stopped and looked back. "The man who dug that spring," she said. "That's the man I want to know. Not Victor Hale, not Elias Grant, just the man willing to work for what matters." "That's who I'm trying to be," Victor said. Lynn nodded slowly. Then she walked back toward the celebration, leaving Victor standing alone in the darkness. But for the first time since Richard Langford had shouted his name across the square, Victor felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. The kind that couldn't be bought or negotiated, only earned, one honest day at a time. Victor didn't return to his mansion. The next morning, he stood at the edge of Ash Hollow's square, watching the sun rise over buildings that finally had hope again, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He would stay, not as Victor Hale, the cattle baron who could solve problems with money and influence, and not as Elias Grant, the fiction he'd created to escape his own life, as someone in between, someone real. Tom Brewster found him sitting on the steps of the boarding house, staring at his bandaged hands. "You planning to stand there all day, or are you going to make yourself useful?" Victor looked up. "I thought you fired me." "I did, but that was before you dug us a miracle." Brewster jerked his thumb toward the freight yard. "Got 3 wagons coming in this afternoon. Could use the help." It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was something. "What's the pay?" Victor asked. "Same as before. $1 a day." Victor stood, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders. "I'll take it." Brewster nodded and walked away, then paused. "One thing, though. We're calling you Elias. The Hale name carries too much weight in this territory. Out here, you're just another pair of hands. That's all I want to be." The freight master studied him for a moment, then gave a brief nod. "See you at noon, then." The work was exactly as brutal as Victor remembered. His hands, still healing from weeks of digging, screamed in protest as he hauled grain sacks and lumber. The bandages made it harder to grip, and twice he dropped loads that would have been easy months ago. But he kept working. Around him, the other laborers maintained a careful distance. Not hostile, exactly, but not friendly either. They were watching, waiting to see if the rich man's dedication would last beyond the dramatic gesture of the spring. Victor understood. Trust wasn't earned with one act of redemption. It was built slowly, through consistent proof that the person you claimed to be matched the person you actually were. So he worked without complaint, took the hardest jobs, stayed late when others left early. And slowly, cautiously, the walls began to lower. By the end of the first week, one of the younger laborers, a kid named Danny, who couldn't have been more than 17, started working alongside him. "Mr. Brewster says you really did dig that whole spring yourself," Danny said, heaving a sack of grain onto the wagon. "Had help toward the end," Victor replied. "But you started it alone?" "Yes." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Victor thought about Lynn's face when she'd discovered his lie. The hurt in her eyes, the trust that had shattered like glass. "Because some things can't be bought," he said finally. "They have to be earned." Danny nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand something beyond his years. They worked in silence after that, but it felt different. Less like isolation and more like companionship. Lynn watched from a distance. She didn't seek Victor out, didn't visit the freight yard or manufacture reasons to cross his path. But she noticed things. The way he arrived at work before dawn and stayed until dark. The way he took on the jobs no one else wanted, the heaviest loads, the messiest work, the tasks that left men exhausted and filthy. The way he never complained, never used his wealth or influence to make things easier. Her father noticed her noticing. "You watch the window a lot these days," Linway said one evening, his voice gentle but knowing. Lin turned from where she'd been staring at the freight yard across the square. "I'm just making sure the laundry is drying properly." Her father smiled, the expression crinkling the weathered skin around his eyes. "The laundry hangs behind the building, daughter, not in front of it." Lin felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "The man who dug the spring. He works hard." "He lied to us." "He did," her father agreed. "But he also saved this town. And from what I hear, he's paying for that lie with honest work." He paused. "The question is not whether he made a mistake. The question is whether he's truly trying to fix it." Lin was quiet. Her father moved to stand beside her, looking out at the square. "When your mother and I came to this country, we had nothing. People saw us as foreigners, outsiders. They judged us before we opened our mouths." That's different, is it?" Her father's voice was mild. "They saw only what was on the surface. Chinese immigrants who didn't belong. They didn't see two people willing to work themselves to exhaustion for a better life. They didn't see your mother's kindness or my determination. They just saw what they expected to see." He looked at his daughter. "Perhaps this Victor Hale is learning the same lesson, that who we are is not what people see on the surface. It's what we prove through our actions." Lin didn't respond, but her father's words settled into her like stones dropped into deep water. The first real conversation happened 2 weeks later. Lin was closing up the laundry for the evening when one of the wooden posts supporting her clothesline snapped. The whole structure collapsed, dumping clean sheets into the dirt. She stood there, staring at the mess, feeling frustration build behind her eyes. This was the third thing to break this month. The building was old, held together by repairs and determination. Every time she fixed one problem, another appeared. "Need help?" Lin turned. Victor stood at the edge of her property, still covered in dust from the freight yard, his bandaged hands hanging at his sides. Part of her wanted to refuse, to prove she could handle everything on her own. But the sheets were dirty, the post was broken, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "The post rotted through," she said. "I need to replace it." Victor examined the damage. "I can fix it. Won't take long." "I can't pay you." "I'm not asking for payment." Lin studied him, looking for ulterior motives, but his expression was simply tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from honest work and not enough sleep. "Why?" she asked. "Because you need help, and I can provide it." Victor met her eyes. "No strings, no expectations, just, let me help." Lin hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Victor got to work. He didn't have tools. His were back at the boarding house, so he borrowed what he needed from the blacksmith. Then he set about not just replacing the broken post, but reinforcing the entire clothesline structure. Lin watched him work, noticing things she hadn't seen before. The methodical way he approached the task, checking each connection point. The care he took to make sure everything was level and secure. The quiet competence that came from someone who'd learned to value the work itself, not just the result. When he finished, the clothesline was stronger than it had been in years. "Thank you," Lin said. Victor nodded, gathering the borrowed tools. "If anything else breaks, let me know." He turned to leave. "Wait!" Victor stopped. Lin disappeared into the laundry and returned a moment later with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She held it out. "You missed dinner working on this. It's not much, but—" Victor took the bundle carefully. Inside was rice, vegetables, and a small portion of fish. It was the same kind of simple meal she'd given him months ago, when he'd been Elias Grant and the world had been simpler. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lin nodded, then went back inside. But as Victor walked away, he glanced back and saw her standing in the doorway, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding. March gave way to April, and Ash Hollow began to transform. The spring water flowed steadily, feeding the town well, and irrigation channels Tom Brewster's crew had dug. Gardens that had withered in the drought burst back to life. The creek, fed by runoff, began flowing again. The town felt different, hopeful, but the change brought new problems. With water secure, more people began arriving, families looking for opportunity, merchants seeing potential profit, opportunists drawn by stability. The town's population nearly doubled in a month. And with growth came conflict. Clayton Marsh, the landlord who'd tried to squeeze Lynn for higher rent, saw an opportunity. He began buying up property, planning to develop Ash Hollow into something bigger, something more profitable, which meant displacing people who'd lived there for years. Victor heard about it in the freight yard. "Marsh is offering Mrs. Patterson $300 for her house," Danny said, stacking lumber. "Says he's going to tear it down and build a hotel." "Mrs. Patterson's lived there for 20 years, another laborer said. "Where's she supposed to go? Marsh doesn't care. He offered old man Tucker half what his land's worth, said if he didn't take it, he'd find a way to make him leave anyway." Victor felt anger stir in his chest. He knew men like Marsh. Had been men like Marsh using wealth and influence to get what they wanted, regardless of who got hurt. "Can anyone stop him?" Danny asked. "How? Marsh owns half the town, and he's got lawyers. What are we supposed to do, sue him?" Victor set down the board he'd been carrying, his mind working. Money had been his language for 20 years. He knew how to fight battles in courtrooms and negotiation tables. But using Victor Hale's resources would mean revealing himself fully. Would mean admitting he'd never really left his old life behind. Would Lynn see that as growth? Or as proof that he'd never changed at all? The answer came that evening. Victor was walking past the laundry when he heard raised voices inside. Clayton Marsh stood in the doorway, his posture aggressive. "I'm making you a generous offer, Miss Lynn, $500 for the building and land. That's more than it's worth. It's not for sale." Lynn's voice was firm but strained. "Everything's for sale at the right price. $600 then. Final offer." "No." Marsh's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. This town is changing, growing. People who don't adapt get left behind or pushed out." "Is that a threat?" "It's reality." Marsh adjusted his coat. "Think about it. You've got 3 days to change your mind. After that, I'll find other ways to acquire what I need." He left, brushing past Victor without acknowledgement. Victor stood in the doorway, looking at Lynn. Her face was pale but composed. Only her hands, clenched at her sides, betrayed her fear. "You heard?" she asked. "Enough!" Lynn walked to the window, staring out at the square. "He's done this to others. Makes offers they can't refuse, then applies pressure until they break. Mrs. Patterson sold last week. The Johnsons are considering it. You're not going to sell." "I can't." Lynn's voice was quiet. "This laundry is all my father and I have. It's our home, our livelihood. If we lose it—" She didn't finish the sentence. Victor's mind raced through possibilities. He could buy the property himself, protect it from Marsh's schemes. He could use his connections, pressure Marsh through business channels. He could solve this the way Victor Hale had always solved problems, with money and power. But that would prove nothing, and it would rob Lynn of her agency, turn her into someone who needed rescuing rather than someone who deserved partnership. "What if there was another way?" Victor said slowly. Lynn turned. "What do you mean?" "Marsh is using money and intimidation. But he's also relying on people being too scared or too isolated to fight back." Victor's thoughts crystallized. What if they weren't isolated? "I don't understand." "Marsh can pressure individuals. But what if the whole town stood together? What if everyone he's trying to displace refused to sell, united?" Lynn's expression shifted from confusion to consideration. "You mean organize, collectively refuse his offers?" "Exactly. He can't develop Ash Hollow if he can't acquire the land. And he can't acquire the land if people refuse to sell. He'll find ways to force them out. He said as much." "Then we document it. Build a legal case. There are laws against coercion and fraud, even out here." Victor paused. "I know people. Lawyers who owe me favors. They could help." Lynn studied him. "Using your connections as Victor Hale?" "Using resources I have access to, yes, but not to solve the problem for you, to give you tools to solve it yourselves." The distinction was subtle but important. Lynn seemed to recognize it. You'd really do that? Help us fight without taking over? This is your town, Victor said. Your home. I'm just offering support. Lynn was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. Tell me what needs to be done. The first town meeting happened 3 days later in the saloon. Nearly 40 people crowded into the space. Everyone Marsh had approached, plus others worried they'd be next. Mrs. Patterson was there, looking guilty for having already sold. Old Man Tucker, defiant despite his age. The Johnsons, holding hands like they were bracing for a storm. And Lynn, standing near the front with quiet determination. Tom Brewster called the meeting to order. We all know why we're here. Clayton Marsh is trying to buy up half the town, and he's not taking no for an answer. Question is, what are we going to do about it? What can we do? Someone called out. He's got money and lawyers. So we get our own lawyers, Victor said from the back of the room. Heads turned. Easy for you to say, Old Man Tucker growled. You're Victor Hale. You've got more money than everyone in this room combined. I do, Victor acknowledged, and I'm offering to use some of it to help, not to solve your problems for you, but to provide access to legal representation you might not be able to afford otherwise. Why? Mrs. Johnson asked. What do you get out of it? Victor looked at Lynn, then back at the crowd. Honestly, nothing material. But I'm learning that some things matter more than profit, and one of them is standing with people who deserve better than to be pushed out of their homes. Murmurs ran through the crowd. How do we know you're not just another rich man looking to control things? Tucker demanded. You don't, Victor said simply. All I can offer is my word and my willingness to work alongside you. The decisions stay with you. The strategy stays with you. I'm just providing resources. Brewster looked around the room. Show of hands. Who's willing to try this? Refuse to sell, document any threats or coercion, and let Elias's lawyer friends help build a case? Slowly, hands rose. Not everyone. Some people were too scared, too tired, too practical. But enough. Lynn's hand was among the first. The battle with Clayton Marsh played out over the next 6 weeks. Victor contacted a lawyer he'd worked with in the past, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in land disputes and had a particular hatred for bullies. She arrived in Ash Hollow with 2 assistants and enough legal knowledge to make Marsh's lawyers nervous. Meanwhile, the townspeople documented everything. When Marsh tried to intimidate Old Man Tucker by having his water supply mysteriously cut off, they photographed the damaged pipes and filed a complaint. When he approached Mrs. Johnson with an offer that included veiled threats about accidents, they recorded the conversation. When he tried to use his influence to block building permits for people who refused to sell, Margaret Chen filed injunctions that tied up his development plans in legal red tape. Marsh fought back hard. He hired additional lawyers, spread rumors, tried to turn townspeople against each other, but the coalition held, and Victor worked alongside them, not as the wealthy benefactor swooping in to save the day, but as one laborer among many, doing whatever needed doing. He helped Old Man Tucker repair his water line. He hauled materials for families making improvements. Marsh's lawyers couldn't block. He sat in on strategy meetings, offering suggestions but never demanding control. And slowly, people stopped seeing Victor Hale the cattle baron. They started seeing someone who showed up, did the work, and stood with them when it mattered. The turning point came in early May. Marsh, frustrated by the legal obstacles and the town's unified resistance, made a critical mistake. He attempted to forge documents claiming he'd purchased properties he hadn't actually acquired, planning to force sales through bureaucratic pressure. Margaret Chen caught it immediately. She filed fraud charges with the territorial governor's office, complete with documentation that proved Marsh had falsified records. The investigation was swift and brutal. Marsh's entire development scheme collapsed. His fraudulent practices extended beyond Ash Hollow. He'd been running similar operations in 3 other towns. He was arrested, his assets frozen, his properties seized pending legal resolution. Ash Hollow was safe. The celebration in the square rivaled the spring water discovery. People who'd been terrified weeks earlier now laughed and embraced, relief washing over them like rain after drought. Victor stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. Margaret Chen appeared beside him, a satisfied smile on her face. Good work, Victor. These people are lucky to have you on their side. I was just supporting their fight. Don't sell yourself short. Your connections made this possible. Their courage made it possible. I just provided tools. Margaret studied him. You've changed since I saw you last. The Victor Hale I knew would have bought the whole town and solved this himself. That Victor Hale didn't understand what he was taking from people. And now? Victor looked across the square to where Lynn stood with her father, both of them smiling with genuine relief. Now I'm learning that the best way to help people isn't to solve their problems for them. It's to stand beside them while they solve it themselves. Margaret nodded slowly. That's wisdom most rich men never learn. She left to join the celebration, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Across the square, Lynn looked up and met his eyes. She didn't wave, didn't call him over, but she smiled. A small, genuine smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. And Victor smiled back. The day after the celebration, Lynn appeared at the freight yard. Victor was loading a wagon when he saw her approaching, a basket in her hands. He set down the crate he'd been carrying. Lynn, I brought lunch, she said, holding up the basket. Thought you might be hungry. It was the first time she'd sought him out since the revelation of his identity. Victor glanced at Brewster, who made a shooing gesture. Go on, we can manage without you for an hour. They walked to the edge of town, to a spot overlooking the valley where the spring water flowed in new channels, feeding gardens and fields. Lynn spread out a blanket and unpacked the basket, rice, vegetables, tea. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Lynn said, Thank you for helping with Marsh. You did the hard part. I just made some introductions. It was more than that. Lynn looked at him. You could have taken over, made it your fight, but you didn't. You let us lead. It was your fight to lead. Other rich men wouldn't see it that way. I'm trying not to be other rich men. Lynn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been watching you these past 2 months. The way you work. The way you help without expecting recognition. The way you've stayed even when you could have left. Victor's heart beat faster. And I think I'm starting to see the man you were trying to show me before. The one beneath the name and the money. She paused. The question is whether that man is real or just another performance. He's real, Victor said. He's the only real thing about me. Lynn reached into the basket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, the tin cup. She filled it with tea from a thermos and held it out. Victor took it, their fingers brushing. I'm not ready to forget what happened, Lynn said quietly. The lie still hurts. The broken trust still matters. I know. But I'm willing to see where this goes, to give the man you're becoming a chance to prove he's genuine. Victor drank the tea, savoring the warmth. That's all I'm asking for, he said. A chance. Lynn nodded. Then let's start there. They sat together on the hillside, looking out over the valley, and for the first time since Richard Langford had shattered his disguise, Victor felt something close to peace. Not redemption. Not yet. But the possibility of it. The understanding that some things, the most important things, couldn't be bought or negotiated or solved with power. They had to be earned. One honest day at a time. One shared meal. One moment of trust carefully rebuilt from the fragments of what had been broken. And as the sun moved across the Montana sky, Victor realized that this, sitting on a hillside with a woman who saw him clearly, both his failures and his efforts to grow beyond them, was worth more than every acre of land he owned. This was what he'd been searching for all along. Not someone who was impressed by Victor Hale, but someone who could believe in the man he was working to become. The weeks that followed carried a rhythm Victor had never known existed. He woke before dawn in his small boarding house room, the space barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, and felt more at home than he ever had in his mansion. He worked at the freight yard until his muscles burned, shared simple meals with people who knew both his names and were learning to trust the man behind them, and spent evenings helping wherever help was needed. Sometimes that meant repairing buildings damaged by the drought and Marsh's neglect. Sometimes it meant sitting with Old Man Tucker on his porch, listening to stories about the territory's early days. And sometimes, more often now, it meant walking past the laundry just as Lynn was closing up, their conversations growing longer and deeper with each passing day. They talked about everything and nothing. Lynn told him about learning English from a school teacher who'd taken pity on a Chinese girl desperate to belong. about her mother's dream of opening a restaurant that had died with her on the journey west, about the loneliness of being different in a place that didn't always welcome difference. Victor told her about the isolation of wealth, about business partners who smiled while calculating how to extract value, about the slow realization that he'd built an empire but forgotten to build a life. "When did you know?" Lynn asked one evening as they sat on the laundry's small porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "That something was missing?" Victor thought about it. "There was a moment, 3 years ago. I closed a deal that made me richer than I'd ever imagined possible. That night, I sat in my study with expensive whiskey and realized I had no one to celebrate with, no one who cared about the victory rather than what it could do for them. That must have been lonely." "It was terrifying," Victor admitted, "because I'd spent 20 years building toward that moment, and when I got there, it meant nothing." Lynn was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that success without someone to share it with is just expensive loneliness." "Your mother was wise." "She was." Lynn smiled sadly. "I wish you could have met her. She would have liked you." "Even after knowing I lied about my identity?" Lynn considered this. "She would have been disappointed in the lie, but she would have appreciated the work you've done to make it right. She believed people should be judged by their direction, not their starting point." Victor felt something warm settle in his chest. "I hope I'm moving in the right direction." "You are," Lynn said quietly. Then she stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I should check on my father. He's been coughing more lately." Concern flickered through Victor. "Is he all right?" "Just a spring cold, I think, but at his age—" She didn't finish the thought. "If you need anything, I'll ask," Lynn interrupted gently. "I'm learning to do that, to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone." She went inside, leaving Victor on the porch with the fading light and a growing sense that something fragile and precious was taking root between them, something worth protecting. Linway's condition worsened over the next week. What had seemed like a simple cold developed into something deeper. His breathing grew labored. His cough turned harsh and rattling. Lynn tried to hide her worry, but Victor saw it in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly when she hung laundry. The town's doctor, an overworked man named Harrison who served 3 settlements, examined Linway and emerged from the back room with a grave expression. "Pneumonia," he said quietly. "His lungs are weak. At his age, this is serious." "What can we do?" Lynn asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "Keep him warm. Make sure he drinks plenty of fluids. There's a medicine that might help, a tincture imported from San Francisco, but it's expensive, and the nearest supply is in Helena, 3 days' ride from here." "How expensive?" Dr. Harrison hesitated. $75 for a week's supply, maybe more depending on availability. Lynn's face went pale. $75 was more than the laundry made in 3 months. "I'll find a way," she said. The doctor nodded sympathetically and left. Victor, who'd been standing outside and heard everything through the open window, felt his hands clench. He could solve this in seconds. 1 telegram, 1 bank transfer, but he'd promised himself, and Lynn, that he wouldn't use his wealth to solve her problems without her consent. That he would support, not rescue. But watching her sit beside her father's bed that evening, holding the old man's frail hand while trying not to cry, Victor felt that promise crack under the weight of necessity. Some principles mattered less than people. Victor found Lynn in the laundry before dawn the next morning. She was sorting through clothes by lamplight, her movements mechanical and exhausted. She hadn't slept, he realized, had probably sat with her father all night. "Lynn." She looked up, and he saw the tears she'd been too proud to shed in front of others. "He's getting worse," she said quietly. "The fever won't break." Victor sat down across from her. "I'm going to Helena. I'll get the medicine." "You heard Dr. Harrison. It's 3 days there and 3 back. My father doesn't have 6 days. Then I'll ride fast, cut it to 4. "Victor, you can't—" "I can," he said firmly. "I have the money. I have a fast horse. And I know the trails." He paused. "Let me help, please." Lynn looked at him for a long moment. "Why? Why does this matter so much to you?" "Because he's your father, because you love him, because I can do something about it, and I won't stand by and watch him suffer when I have the means to help." "But your philosophy?" about not using money to solve problems. That philosophy doesn't apply when someone's life is at stake, Victor said. There's a difference between using wealth to control people and using it to save them. I'm still learning where that line is, but I know it exists. Lynn's eyes filled with tears again. I can't pay you back. Not for years. I'm not asking you to. Then I'll owe you. You won't owe me anything, Victor interrupted gently. This isn't a transaction, Lynn. This is me helping someone I... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Someone I love, he'd almost said. But that felt too big, too soon. Lynn seemed to hear the unspoken words anyway. Her expression softened. Go, she said quietly. Please. And hurry. Victor stood, then hesitated. If something happens, if he gets worse while I'm gone, I'll be strong, Lynn said. We both will. Just come back safely. Victor nodded and left before he could say anything that might make leaving harder. He rode out of Ash Hollow as the sun crested the eastern hills, pushing his horse harder than was wise, driven by the image of Lynn's tear-stained face and the old man's labored breathing. The journey to Helena normally took 3 leisurely days, 2 if you pushed, but knew when to rest your horse. Victor planned to make it in a day and a half. He rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only to water his horse at streams and switch to a fresh mount he'd arranged at a ranch, owned by a business associate who owed him favors. The terrain was brutal, rocky trails that climbed through mountain passes and descended into valleys where the spring runoff had turned gentle creeks into rushing torrents. Victor's body screamed in protest, his legs cramped, his back felt like broken glass. The healing wounds on his hands split open again, bleeding through the reins. But he kept riding. As the sun set, he pushed into territory most travelers avoided after dark, narrow passes where a misstep could send horse and rider tumbling down steep slopes. The horse stumbled once, catching itself at the last moment. Victor's heart hammered, but he didn't slow down. He rode through the night, navigating by moonlight and memory, thinking about Lynn sitting beside her father's bed, thinking about the kindness she'd shown a stranger months ago, thinking about how she'd looked at him on that hillside, offering a second chance he didn't deserve but desperately wanted to earn. Dawn found him on the outskirts of Helena, exhausted and half frozen, his horse lathered and trembling, but alive. Both of them alive. Helena was bigger than Ash Hollow, a supply hub for mining operations scattered through the surrounding mountains. Victor found the medical supply office before it opened and waited outside, pacing like a caged animal. When the proprietor, a fastidious man named Wilkins, finally unlocked the door, Victor was inside before the man could finish his greeting. I need pneumonia medicine, the imported tincture from San Francisco. As much as you have. Wilkins blinked at the disheveled stranger who'd materialized in his shop. That's expensive. I don't care about the cost. Do you have it? I have 3 bottles. That's a week's supply, maybe more depending on the patient's size. I'll take all 3. How much? Wilkins named a price, $90, higher than Dr. Harrison had estimated. Victor didn't haggle. He counted out the money from the roll he'd brought, his bleeding hands leaving dark smudges on the bills. Wilkins' eyes widened at the blood. Sir, you're injured. The medicine, now. The proprietor packed the bottles carefully, wrapping them in cloth and paper to prevent breakage. Victor took the package, tucked it securely in his saddlebag, and walked outside to find his horse. The animal was in no condition to make the return journey. Neither was Victor, if he was honest, but honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford. He mounted up, turned the horse east, and rode. The return journey blurred into an endless cycle of pain and determination. Victor's horse began to falter around noon, favoring its left foreleg. He found another ranch, explained the emergency, and paid triple the value of a fresh mount to make the trade immediately. The new horse was younger, stronger, but unfamiliar with Victor's riding style. It fought him for the first hour before settling into the punishing pace. Victor rode through the afternoon and into another night, his vision blurring with exhaustion, his body operating on instinct and willpower alone. He thought about Lynn to stay awake, about the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching, about the quiet strength in her voice when she talked about her father, about the trust she was slowly, carefully placing in him, trust he would die before betraying again. The medicine bottles pressed against his side through the saddlebag, fragile and essential. If they broke, if he failed, Lynn's father might die. And Lynn would lose the last family she had. Victor couldn't let that happen, wouldn't let that happen. He pushed harder. He rode into Ash Hollow 38 hours after leaving, his horse on the verge of collapse, his own body beyond exhaustion into a state of numb automaticity. The sun was just rising, painting the square in soft gold light. Victor dismounted in front of the laundry, more fell than dismounted, and stumbled to the door. It opened before he could knock. Lynn stood there, her face drawn with sleepless worry, her eyes widening as she took in his appearance. "Victor, the medicine," he gasped, fumbling with the saddlebag. His hands shook so badly he couldn't work the buckles. Lynn helped him, pulling out the carefully wrapped package. "You got it," she whispered. "You actually got it. Is he still alive? Barely, but alive." Dr. Harrison appeared behind Lynn, summoned by the commotion. He took the medicine, examined the bottles, and nodded approval. "This is good quality, fresh. It might just work." He looked at Victor. "How long did this journey take you?" 38 hours? The doctor's eyebrows rose. "That's impossible. Helena is 3 days away." "Not if you don't stop," Victor said, then swayed as his legs finally gave out. Lynn caught him, her small frame surprisingly strong. "Help me get him inside," she said to Dr. Harrison. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're half dead." Lynn's voice was firm. "You saved my father. Now let me take care of you." They half carried, half dragged Victor into the laundry's back room, laying him on a cot near where Lin Wei lay sleeping, his breathing still labored but marginally improved from yesterday. Dr. Harrison administered the medicine to the old man, then turned his attention to Victor. He cleaned and bandaged the reopened wounds on Victor's hands, examined his exhausted body for serious injury, and delivered his diagnosis with professional detachment. "You're severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from extreme exhaustion. You need rest, fluids, and food, in that order." "I'm fine," Victor mumbled, already half asleep. "You're stubborn," the doctor corrected. "But you'll live. Miss Lynn, make sure he drinks water when he wakes, and don't let him work for at least 3 days." "I won't," Lynn promised. Victor wanted to protest, but darkness was already pulling him under. The last thing he felt was Lynn's hand resting gently on his shoulder. The last thing he heard was her whispered voice. "Thank you." Victor woke to the sound of rain pattering against the roof. For a moment, he had no idea where he was. The room was unfamiliar, small, simple, smelling of soap and herbs. Then memory returned. The ride to Helena, the medicine, the desperate journey back. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in his body screamed protest. Easy. Lynn appeared beside the cot, holding a cup of water. "How long have I been asleep?" Victor asked, his voice rough. "Almost 2 days." "2." Victor struggled to rise. "I need to get back to work. Brewster will—" Lynn pushed him back down gently but firmly. "Mr. Brewster knows where you are. I sent word. He said to take the time you need." She held out the water. "Drink." Victor obeyed, the cool water soothing his parched throat. "Your father?" Lynn's face transformed with relief and joy. "Better, much better. The medicine worked. The fever broke yesterday evening. He's still weak, but Dr. Harrison says he'll recover." Victor felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying finally release. "I'm glad." "You saved his life," Lynn said quietly. "That ride you made. Dr. Harrison said no one should have attempted it alone, that it was reckless and dangerous and you could have died. But I didn't." "But you could have." Lynn's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why would you risk so much? For an old man you barely know?" Victor met her gaze. "I know you, and I know what losing him would do to you." That was enough. Lynn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My father wants to meet you. Properly, I mean. Not just see the stranger who saved his life." "I'd like that." Lynn helped Victor sit up, slowly this time, and walked him to the adjacent cot where Lin Wei lay propped against pillows, still pale but unmistakably improved. The old man studied Victor with sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded him of his daughter's. "Mr. Hale," he said in careful English, "my daughter tells me you rode through the mountains like a madman to bring me medicine." "I rode fast," Victor admitted. "The madman part might be accurate. A small smile touched Lin Wei's lips. She also tells me you are the man who lied about his identity, dug a spring with his bare hands, and fights landlords who exploit the vulnerable. That's also accurate. And she tells me you care deeply for her, though you have not yet found the courage to say so directly. Victor's face heated. Sir, Lin Wei held up a frail hand. I am an old man who nearly died. I do not have time for careful courtship and polite dancing around truth, so I will speak plainly. His gaze intensified. Do you love my daughter? The room fell silent except for the rain. Victor looked at Lin, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between mortification and hope. He could dodge the question, make a joke, deflect, but Lin Wei was right. Life was too short for anything less than honesty. Yes, Victor said quietly. I do. Lin's breath caught. Her father nodded, satisfied. Good, because she loves you too, though she is too stubborn to admit it yet. Father, Lin's face turned crimson. It is true, daughter. I see how you look at him, how you speak of him, how you could barely function while he was gone, watching the road and jumping at every sound. Lin Wei smiled gently. You think I do not notice these things because I am old and sick? But I notice everything. Lin looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her. Victor, despite his exhaustion and embarrassment, felt something light and warm bloom in his chest. She loves you too. Lin Wei continued. Mr. Hale, Victor, you have made mistakes. The lie about your identity was wrong. It hurt my daughter and broke her trust. I know, Victor said. I've been trying to, but, Lin Wei interrupted, you have also worked harder than any rich man I have ever heard of to make amends. You have labored with your hands. You have stood beside this town when you could have simply bought it. You have risked your life for an old man you had no obligation to save. He paused. These are not the actions of a man playing pretend. These are the actions of a man becoming who he truly wants to be. Victor felt his throat tighten. My daughter deserves someone who sees her worth, Lin Wei said. Someone who treats her as an equal, not a prize to be won or a problem to be solved. Can you be that man? I'm trying to be, Victor said honestly. Every day I'm trying. Lin Wei studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. That is enough, he said. For now, that is enough. He closed his eyes, exhausted by the conversation. Lin adjusted his blankets, then turned to Victor. Come on, let him rest. They stepped outside into the soft rain. Lin pulled a shawl around her shoulders, staring at the gray sky. I'm sorry about that, she said. My father can be direct. I didn't mind. He had no right to put you on the spot like that, to ask about... She stopped, embarrassed. About whether I love you? Victor said gently. Lin's hands tightened on the shawl. Yes, that. Victor stepped closer, close enough to see the rain beating on her hair, the uncertainty in her eyes. He wasn't wrong, Victor said quietly. I do love you. I think I have since the day you gave me water and asked for nothing in return. Since the day you saw a nobody laborer and treated him with more dignity than anyone ever showed Victor Hale. Lin looked up at him, rain and tears mingling on her cheeks. I'm terrified, she whispered. Terrified that this is another beautiful lie. That I'll believe in it and wake up to find it was all performance. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, Victor said. I can't promise I'll always get it right. But I can promise that what I feel is real. That the man standing here, the one who dug through rock and rode through mountains and works in the freight yard, he's real. And he loves you. Lin closed her eyes, and Victor saw the war being fought behind them. Trust and fear, hope and caution, love and the memory of betrayal. When she opened them again, she said, I need time, to be sure, to let trust rebuild completely. I understand. But she hesitated. My father was right about one thing. I do care for you, more than I want to, more than is probably wise. Victor felt his heart beat faster. Is that enough? Lin asked. For now? Victor smiled, feeling rain soak through his shirt and not caring at all. That's everything, he said. Lin smiled back, tentative but genuine. And for a moment they stood together in the rain, two people learning to trust the fragile, precious thing growing between them. Learning that love wasn't built in grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was built in moments like this, in honest words spoken in the rain, in patience, in time, and the willingness to let something real develop at its own pace. And as Victor stood there, watching Lynn's smile grow more confident, he knew with absolute certainty that he would spend however long it took proving that the man she was learning to trust was worth the risk, because she was worth everything. The summer that followed Linway's recovery brought changes to Ash Hollow that no one could have predicted. The spring water Victor had discovered didn't just save the town, it transformed it. Gardens flourished where dust had reigned. New families arrived, drawn by stories of resilience and community. The general store expanded, a second boarding house opened. Even talk of a proper schoolhouse began circulating among the families with children. Through it all, Victor worked. He hauled freight with Tom Brewster's crew, his body now lean and strong from months of honest labor. He helped build the new schoolhouse foundation, mixing mortar alongside farmers and merchants. He spent evenings repairing buildings, teaching Danny and other young men the carpentry skills he'd learned through trial and error. And he courted Lynn, not with expensive gifts or grand gestures, those belonged to Victor Hale, and that man felt increasingly distant, like a coat that no longer fit. Instead, he courted her with presence, with showing up, with small acts of devotion that cost nothing but meant everything. He fixed the laundry's door when the hinges rusted through. He split firewood on summer evenings, stacking it neatly for the coming winter. He sat with Lin Wei on the porch, learning broken Cantonese phrases that made the old man laugh at his terrible pronunciation. And he walked with Lin every Sunday evening, their conversations ranging from profound to mundane, building a foundation of shared understanding that felt more solid than anything Victor had ever constructed with money. Lynn, for her part, remained cautious. She accepted his help, but insisted on reciprocating, mending his shirts, sharing meals, teaching him to appreciate the subtle art of proper tea preparation. She spoke honestly about her fears and her hopes, never pretending the past hadn't happened, but also never using it as a weapon. And slowly, carefully, like a plant growing toward sunlight, she opened her heart to the possibility that the man beside her was real, that his transformation wasn't performance, that what they were building together could last. The first real test came in late June. A messenger arrived from Victor's estate, Martin, the butler who'd served him for 15 years. Victor was at the freight yard when Martin rode in, his expensive suit and groomed horse-drawing stares from the townspeople. "Mr. Hale," Martin said, dismounting with practiced elegance, "I apologize for the intrusion, but there's a matter that requires your immediate attention." Victor set down this crate he'd been carrying, aware of every eye watching this exchange. Tom Brewster appeared at his shoulder. "Everything all right?" "I don't know yet," Victor said. He turned to Martin. "What's wrong?" "The Territorial Governor's Office has filed an inquiry into water rights on the Eastern Range. Several ranchers are claiming you've been diverting water from established channels, disrupting their operations." Martin's voice was professionally neutral. "Your lawyers need your signature on legal documents, and there are decisions that only you can make." Victor felt the weight of his old life settling back onto his shoulders. "How serious is this?" "Serious enough that failure to respond could result in seizure of property and substantial fines. The hearing is in 3 weeks." The freight yard had gone quiet. Everyone was listening now. Victor looked at Lynn, who stood in the doorway of the laundry, watching with an expression he couldn't read. "I need to go back," he said quietly. "For how long?" Tom Brewster asked. "I don't know. A few weeks at least. Maybe longer, depending on how the legal proceedings go." Martin shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, there's another matter. The ranch has been operating at a loss in your absence. Without your oversight, several contracts have fallen through. The Board of Investors is demanding a meeting to discuss the future of the operation." Victor closed his eyes. He'd known this was coming, had known he couldn't abandon his responsibilities indefinitely. But facing it now, after months of freedom, felt like being locked back in a cage. "Give me an hour," he told Martin. "I need to settle some things here." The butler nodded and withdrew to the boarding house. Victor turned to find Lynn walking toward him. "You have to go," she said. Not a question, a statement. "I do, but I'll come back." Will you? Lynn's voice was gentle but probing. Or will you remember what it's like to have power and influence and realize that this— She gestured at the dusty square, the simple buildings, the life they'd been building— isn't enough anymore? Lynn, I'm not accusing you of anything, she interrupted. I'm asking honestly, because if you're going to leave, if you're going to return to being Victor Hale full-time, I need to know now. Before I— She stopped, looking away. Before I let myself love you completely, Victor heard in the silence. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I have responsibilities I can't ignore. Legal matters that affect people who work for me, depend on me. I need to handle this. I understand that. But Ash Hollow is my home now. You are my home. This life I've built here, it's the only real thing I've ever had. Victor took her hand carefully. I will come back. I promise you that. Lynn searched his face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Then go. Handle what needs handling. But Victor— She squeezed his hand. Don't lose yourself in that world again. Don't become someone who forgets what matters. I won't, Victor said, because what matters is right here. The journey back to his estate felt surreal. Victor rode in a comfortable carriage beside Martin, wearing clothes that had been cleaned and pressed, surrounded by the trappings of wealth he'd almost forgotten. The mansion appeared on the horizon like a monument to someone else's life. When they arrived, servants materialized to handle the luggage and horses. The house manager appeared with updates and questions. Lawyers waited in the study with stacks of documents requiring attention. Victor walked through it all feeling like a ghost haunting his own past. The legal matter was complex but solvable. A neighboring rancher had filed complaints about water usage, claiming Victor's irrigation systems were diverting flow from established channels. The accusations were technically accurate but legally dubious. Water rights in the territory were poorly defined, and Victor's lawyers had documented every aspect of his operations. Victor spent 3 days in meetings, reviewing contracts and maps, preparing testimony. The rancher, a man named Garrett, who'd been trying to expand his own holdings, was using the legal system to pressure Victor into selling land Garrett wanted for himself. The old Victor would have crushed this challenge immediately, would have used his wealth and connections to make Garrett regret the audacity of filing complaints. But the man who dug a spring with his bare hands approached it differently. On the 4th day, Victor rode out to Garrett's ranch alone. The rancher met him on the porch, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Hale, didn't expect you to show your face here. Can we talk? Victor asked. Without lawyers and threats? Garrett studied him suspiciously. Then he jerked his head toward a pair of chairs. 5 minutes. They sat in the shade of the porch overhang, and Victor laid out a proposal. The water dispute was real. Both ranches needed reliable irrigation. But fighting in court would cost both of them time and money they could spend more productively. Instead, Victor suggested a shared water management system. They would work together to optimize the irrigation channels, ensuring both operations had adequate supply. Victor would cover the cost of the engineering survey and initial construction. Garrett would provide labor and maintenance expertise. Why would you do that? Garrett asked. You've got the better legal position. You could win this fight. Probably, Victor agreed, but winning isn't the same as solving the problem, and I've learned that working with people usually yields better results than working against them. Garrett was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You're not what I expected. I'm not what I used to be. They shook hands on the agreement, pending approval from both sets of lawyers. When Victor returned to his estate that evening, he felt lighter than he had in days. Problem solved. Not through power or intimidation, but through partnership. It was what Lynn would have done. What the man he was becoming would do. The board meeting was harder. 6 investors sat around Victor's dining table, each representing substantial capital invested in his cattle operation. They were wealthy, influential men accustomed to returns on investment and impatient with anything that threatened their profits. The chairman, a railroad magnate named Thurston, opened the meeting with barely concealed hostility. Victor, we've been patient. You disappeared for months. The operation lost focus and profits declined. We need assurance that you're committed to this enterprise. I am committed, Victor said. Then where have you been? Learning what matters. Thurston's eyes narrowed. What matters is return on investment. What matters is growing this operation to dominate the regional market. What matters is the empire we've been building. Victor looked around the table at men who reminded him of who he used to be. Driven, ambitious, measuring success purely in financial terms. He'd spent 20 years becoming them, and he'd been miserable. "I've been in a town called Ash Hollow," Victor said quietly, "working as a laborer, living in a boarding house, discovering what it's like to be valued for what I do rather than what I own." The room fell silent. One investor, a younger man named Patterson, laughed nervously. "Is this a joke?" "No, it's the truth, and I've realized something important." Victor leaned forward. "I built this cattle empire because I thought success meant accumulating as much as possible. But I was wrong. Success means building something that matters, something that improves lives rather than just extracting value from them." "That's naive," Thurston said coldly. "Maybe, but it's honest." Victor pulled out papers he'd prepared. "I'm proposing we restructure the operation, reduce our footprint, focus on sustainable practices that support the communities we operate in rather than dominating them. Share more profits with the workers who actually do the labor, build partnerships instead of monopolies." "That would cut our returns by 30%, another investor protested. "In the short term, yes, but it would create long-term stability, and it would let me sleep at night." Thurston stood. "This is unacceptable. We didn't invest in your operation to fund your personal journey of self-discovery. We invested to make money." "I understand that, which is why I'm offering to buy out anyone who wants to leave." Victor laid out the terms: fair market value for their shares, paid within 90 days. "You're going to bankrupt yourself," Thurston said. "Maybe, but I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and empty." 3 investors took the buyout immediately. 2 stayed, intrigued by Victor's vision despite their reservations. Patterson, the younger investor, lingered after the others left. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest," he said. "Probably both," Victor admitted. "For what it's worth, I think you're right. The old model, extract everything, care about nothing, it's dying. People want to support businesses that care about more than profits." Patterson extended his hand. "I'm with you. Let's see if we can prove you're not crazy." They shook on it. Victor spent 2 more weeks handling the restructuring. He sold off portions of the ranch that had been acquired through aggressive expansion, returning land to smaller ranchers who'd been pressured out. He renegotiated contracts with suppliers, prioritizing fair terms over maximum profit. He established profit-sharing programs for the ranch workers, ensuring they benefited directly from the operation's success. And he arranged for the estate to be managed by a team he trusted, freeing him from the day-to-day obligations that had once consumed his life. Martin found him in the study on his last evening at the mansion. "Everything is arranged, sir. The management team will send weekly reports. You can oversee operations remotely." "Thank you, Martin, for everything. For managing things while I was gone. For not judging my choices." The butler allowed himself a small smile. "If I may speak freely, sir, you seem happier now than in all the years I've known you." "I am." "Then you're making the right choice." Victor looked around the study one last time, at the expensive furniture and imported artwork, at the symbols of a success that had never actually satisfied him. "I'm going home, Martin." "I know, sir. And if I may say so, it's about time." Victor rode into Ash Hollow on a warm July evening, arriving just as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The town looked the same: weathered buildings, dusty streets, people finishing their daily work. But to Victor, it looked like everything. He left his horse at the livery and walked toward the laundry, his heart beating faster with each step. Lynn was hanging clothes on the line, her movements practiced and efficient. She didn't see him at first. Victor stopped at the edge of the property, watching her work, thinking about how far they'd both come. Then she turned, and her eyes met his. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Lynn dropped the shirt she'd been holding and ran. Victor caught her as she reached him, and she threw her arms around his neck with a force that nearly knocked him backward. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I promised I would." "I know, but part of me was still afraid." She pulled back to look at him. "Did you handle everything?" The legal matters. The business? I did. The water dispute is settled. We're building a partnership instead of fighting a war. And the ranch is restructured. I'm still the owner, but I have managers handling the daily operations. I'll need to visit occasionally, but he smiled. My home is here now, with you. Lynn's eyes searched his face. You're sure? You won't regret giving up that life? I'm not giving it up. I'm putting it in proper perspective. The ranch is a responsibility I take seriously, but it's not who I am. Victor cupped her face gently. You are who I am. This town, this life we're building. That's what matters. Lynn closed her eyes, and Victor saw a tear slip down her cheek. I was so scared, she whispered. Scared that you'd go back and remember all the reasons why a rich, powerful man shouldn't want a simple life with a laundrywoman in a dusty frontier town. Lynn, look at me. She opened her eyes. You are not simple. You are extraordinary. You saw value in a stranger when everyone else saw only poverty. You stood up to Clayton Marsh when others fled. You balanced strength and kindness in ways I'm still learning. Victor's voice grew rough with emotion. And this life, this supposedly simple life, is the richest thing I've ever known. Because it's real. Because it's built on truth instead of performance. Victor, I love you, he said, the words coming easily now. I love your courage and your compassion. I love the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love coming home to you at the end of a hard day and knowing that you see me, really see me, not my money or my power, but the man I'm trying to become. Lynn was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. I love you too, she said. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I can't help it. I love the man who dug through stone for water, the man who rode through mountains to save my father, the man who works harder than anyone to prove he's worthy of trust. She touched his face. I love you, Victor Hale. All of you. The past mistakes and the present efforts and the future we could build together. Victor kissed her then, gentle and reverent, tasting salt and sweetness and promise. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Marry me, Victor said. Lynn laughed, surprised. Is that a question or a demand? It's a hope, a plea, a prayer. He smiled. Marry me, Lynn, not because I have money or land or power. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and we're better together than apart. Lynn pretended to consider it, though her eyes sparkled with joy. Will you promise to keep working at the freight yard? To not solve every problem with money? I promise. Will you promise to learn proper Cantonese instead of mangling it? I'll try my best. And will you promise to never lie to me again, no matter how noble the intention? Victor's expression grew serious. I promise. Complete honesty. Always. Lynn nodded slowly. Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Victor picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. Linway appeared on the porch, awakened by the commotion. He took one look at them and smiled. Finally, he said in Cantonese. He asked me to marry him, Lynn called out in English. Good. It's about time. The old man shuffled back inside, muttering about young people taking forever to make obvious decisions. Victor and Lynn stood together in the gathering darkness, holding each other, planning a future that had seemed impossible months ago. Small wedding, Lynn said. Just family and close friends. Whatever you want. And I want to keep working. The laundry matters to me. Of course. And we're living here, not at your mansion. Victor looked at the small laundry building, cramped and weathered and perfect. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. They married in late August on a Sunday afternoon. The ceremony took place beside the spring Victor had dug, the water flowing clear and constant, a symbol of the life they'd found together. Dr. Harrison officiated, reading from a simple service while the entire town gathered to witness. Lynn wore a dress Mrs. Calloway and the other women had sewn together, white cotton with delicate embroidery along the collar and cuffs. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just beautiful in its simplicity. Victor wore his work clothes, cleaned and pressed, because that's who he was now. Not a cattle baron in expensive suits, but a man who earned his living with honest labor. Tom Brewster stood as Victor's witness. Lynn's father, fully recovered now, walked his daughter to stand beside the man who'd saved his life. "Dearly beloved," Dr. Harrison began, then paused as Victor and Lynn clasped hands, their fingers intertwining naturally. The vows were simple but profound. Victor promised to honor Lynn, to see her clearly, to build a life based on truth rather than pretense. Lynn promised to trust him, to believe in the man he was becoming, to stand beside him through whatever came. When Dr. Harrison pronounced them married, the crowd erupted in cheers. Danny whistled loudly. Mrs. Calloway dabbed at her eyes. Old Man Tucker raised a flask in salute, but Victor and Lynn barely noticed. They were looking at each other, seeing past and present and future all at once. Seeing the strangers they'd been, a rich man searching for authenticity and a woman who saw worth in everyone. Seeing the people they'd become, partners in building something real. Seeing the life stretching ahead of them, full of ordinary days made extraordinary by love and commitment. Lynn pulled something from her pocket. The dented tin cup. She'd carried it with her, Victor realized, a reminder of where they'd started. "You look thirsty," she said, her eyes bright with joy and tears. Victor took the cup, filled it from the spring they stood beside, and drank. The water tasted like redemption, like forgiveness, like home. He handed the cup to Lynn, who drank as well, then held it between them, a symbol of the simple gift that had started everything. "Thank you," Victor said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me, for giving me water when I was a stranger, for believing I could be better than I was." Lynn smiled. "You were never a stranger, not really. I saw who you were beneath everything else. I just had to wait for you to see it too." The celebration moved to the town square, where tables had been set up with food and drink donated by everyone in Ash Hollow. It wasn't fancy, no imported delicacies or expensive wines, just honest food shared by honest people. Victor sat beside his wife, watching the sun set over the valley, and felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. Tom Brewster approached, raising a glass. "To the man who came here with nothing and found everything. And to the woman smart enough to make him work for it." Everyone laughed and drank. Lynn leaned against Victor's shoulder. "No regrets?" "About what?" "Giving up the mansion, the power, the empire." Victor looked around at the simple celebration, at people who'd become family, at the town he'd helped save, and that had saved him in return. "I gave up nothing that mattered," he said, "and gained everything I needed." 6 months later, in the deep cold of winter, Victor stood in the freight yard loading a wagon beside Danny and 2 other workers. Snow dusted the ground. The air bit with cold. His hands were chapped and red despite the gloves. And he was happy. Lynn appeared at lunchtime with a basket of food, as she did most days now. They ate together on a bench overlooking the valley, talking about ordinary things. The laundry's business, the progress on the new schoolhouse, Linway's improved health. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just life. Real, honest, beautiful life. "I got a letter from Martin today," Victor mentioned. "The ranch had a good quarter. The profit-sharing program is working well. The workers are more invested, more productive." "I'm glad," Lynn said. "See? Doing the right thing can also be good business." "You were right about a lot of things." "I usually am," Lynn said with mock seriousness. Victor laughed and pulled her close despite the cold. Across the square, the spring water flowed through channels that fed gardens and wells. The sound a constant reminder of what could be built with honest work and determination. The laundry thrived, the town grew, the ranch operated successfully under the new model. But more important than any of that, Victor Hale, the man who'd once owned everything and felt nothing, had found something money couldn't buy. He'd found someone who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, someone who'd given him water when he was thirsty and a home when he was lost. Someone who'd taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by the land he owned or the gold he accumulated. It was measured by the life he chose to build and the people he chose to build it with. That evening, Victor and Lynn walked home together through the snow, her hand warm in his, their footprints marking a path through the gathering white. The tin cup sat on a shelf in their small home, dented and worn and more precious than any treasure Victor had ever possessed, because it represented the beginning of everything, a simple gesture of kindness that had changed 2 lives forever. And in a dusty frontier town called Ash Hollow, where spring water flowed and honest people built honest lives, that was worth more than all the empires in the world.